Hey guys, welcome back! This card is not as good as you think it is, and today we're gonna talk about why. This may come as a shock to some of you, seeing as Miracle Fusion is played in one of the top 3 decks, being Hero Frogs. And I think it's good to know why a card might be good or bad in your deck, to better understand when you can play it, or even if you should play it. Cards rotate in and out of metagames. There are certainly some formats where your deck might need to be more explosive or less explosive and focus on the long game, depending on what other people are doing. This is exactly what we're going to talk about in today's video. So, to start things off, what does Miracle Fusion really do? Well, you can summon an Elemental Hero Fusion monster, either Absolute Zero or Gaia, from your extra deck, by banishing its fusion materials from your graveyard or field. So, preferably in decks where you can either send a lot of cards to the graveyard quickly to easily fuel up the Miracle Fusion to make it live as early as possible, and decks where you naturally play Earth or Water monsters along with a hero package to easily be able to meet the requirements for these fusion monsters. Of course, Absolute Zero is a lot stronger than Gaia, seeing as he floats when he leaves the field. The attack threshold in Edison is generally around 23-2400. Seeing as cards like Kai's the Shadow Monarch is a 2400 attack monster, being able to summon Absolute Zero attack over him is a good play. So what we can conclude for Miracle Fusion is that you mainly want to summon Absolute Zero, but Gaia is also of course an option if you have Earth monsters in your deck. So keeping that in mind, mainly decks where you can play Water monsters to facilitate Absolute Zero is Miracle Fusion's main point in Edison format. Miracle gets better in later formats when you have The Shining, for example, in 2011, or in 2012 when you get Escorado being a dark monster, being able to use other engines and better generic cards in your deck. In Edison, the only generic water monsters we have really are Swap Frog, which can get you Treeborn Frog, and Deep Sea Diva. To better understand Miracle Fusion, we need to determine what type of card roll it is. Using card rolls to categorize cards is a useful tool to better understand what a card's functionality actually is. So if you look at Miracle Fusion, of course it's a spell card, but Miracle Fusion is not the same as something like Book of Moon or Upstart Goblin. This is more akin to something like Dark Arm Dragon or Kai's the Shadow Monarch. A common word to describe these type of cards is to categorize them as bombs. So what is a bomb? A bomb is a card that heavily swings the game in your favor when you either activate it or summon it. Cards like Substitute and Future Fusion can also be considered bombs, but for the sake of discussion, it's easier to keep these cards as starter cards, seeing as their main functionality is getting your engine going, rather than comparing them one-to-one to something like Dark Arm Dragon or Miracle Fusion, as these are more akin to something like Elemental Hero Stratos or Swap Frog, seeing as their main purpose is getting your engine going. Even though their power level is very high and definitely raise the ceiling of your deck. So how many of these bombs should you play in your deck? Of course, you can put a dozen bombs in your deck and you'll see one almost every single hand. But the issue is, these cards generally are not good early game. That's why they're considered bombs. That's why their power level is so high. If something like Dark Arm Dragon would be as good as this and also have the effect of Stratos, it just wouldn't be a Edison format card. It'd be much more akin to a modern card, seeing as it has dual purpose. For older Yu-Gi-Oh, a lot of the cards are single use. So Kai's it's a level 6 tribute summon. When you summon it, you can banish a card, and if it's a dark, it burns them for 1000. That's one effect. If this was printed in 2024, it would have 3 effects. It would be able to normal summon itself and special summon itself and be full combo on its own. How do bombs in other decks generally look? For something like Blackwing, their main bomb is Dark Arm Dragon. Whirlwind is not really considered a bomb, because you need to pair it with another card, and Whirlwind does not do anything on its own. If you look at something like Dark Arm Dragon or Kai's the Shadow Monarch or Miracle Fusion, these are cards that put a big monster on the field and heavily swing the game in your favor as you are able to clear what they're doing, or you're able to present a very large threat. Something like Black Whirlwind more so just gives a bonus effect to all of your Blackwings. Black Whirlwind with Shura says that Shura effectively searches a monster on summon. It is more akin to an extender. This can sometimes come back to bite Blackwing actually, seeing as in the late game, they eventually run out of strong cards that can win them the game or swing the game back in their favor. If Dark Arm Dragon is not live, there's not a lot of cards that the Blackwing deck can top deck that can immediately deal with a very large field and their potential follow-up. But the Blackwing deck is still a very strong deck because all the individual cards are very strong. Shura, Blizzard, Kalut, Sirocco are all very good cards in Edison format. Comparing these cards to something in the Hero Beat deck where Alias is a 1900 attack vanilla. The reason why Blackwing gets away with only having one bomb in their deck is because the card quality is just so high. You're able to easily access the extra deck through cards like Gale and Blizzard, so your deck is more of a toolbox deck. Not needing to draw these bombs, being able to just summon a Goya Guardian at ease with a Blizzard when you have a 4-star engrave is effectively a bomb. Summoning a Blizzard late game is almost as good as summoning a Caius. For the Vayu deck, the bombs it has is Dark Arm Dragon, Burial, and Return. Seeing as the Vayu deck naturally fuels up the Banish Zone very easily, being able to utilize cards like Return and Burial, giving you a much better late game, and also playing cards like Caius the Shadow Monarch, depending on what type of version of the deck you're playing. This is the general card you see in the Vayu deck. So let's say you play 2 Caius and one of these, that's 5 bombs. This gives you a very high chance of being able to swing the game in your favor. But this also might come back to bite you, since when you're playing all of these bombs, seeing a lot of these cards early game can cause you to lose, making the Vayu deck simply less consistent than Blackwing's. But having all of these bombs makes the Vayu deck one of the best at top decking in the late game. For Dream Frogs, the main bombs that deck utilizes are Caius, Risa, and Lad. The good thing about Dream Frogs is that the deck is so consistent at getting 3-1 Frog into the graveyard that being able to summon a Caius or Risa at turn 3 is usually something you always end up doing, while setting up for something like a Dark Arm Dragon, Burial, or Return, as previously mentioned in the Vayu deck, is usually reserved for the late game. That's why the Frog deck is naturally seen as a faster deck, because it's able to put you on a clock. These bombs are all very easily summonable. Sometimes people are not playing Lad, it kind of depends on the meta game. This is one of the hardest cards to summon in the deck, seeing as it does require 2 tributes, but the payoff is so great that a lot of people do include 1 or 2 copies of this card. As we've already mentioned, you of course cannot play a dozen bombs in your deck, but you can for sure play some of them. You don't want Zero either, because then your deck is just not going to be strong enough. That's why a deck like Hero Beat is often not the one that wins tournaments, because it just doesn't have the ceiling to compete. Now, for Hero Frogs, the bombs this deck utilizes are Caius, usually 1 or 2 Risa, and 3 copies of Miracle Fusion. I'm sure you can see that the number of bombs in this deck is much higher than all the other decks. This does make the deck very strong. The Hero Frog deck is one of the decks with the highest ceiling in the format. Of course, something like Dragon Turbo is able to do the most, but that deck has a lot of flaws. So for a quote-unquote real deck, the ceiling of this deck is extremely high, because it's able to play a mid-range game, but also sometimes you can just absolutely explode with all these bombs in the deck. Now, this doesn't come without any flaws. A lot of the games that you lose with the Hero Frog deck are because you drew too many of these cards early game without a way to utilize them. Breaking on 1 or 2 Miracle Fusions before you see the Hero Monsters can cause you to lose games because your hand is just not good enough. The issue with this deck also is that you play so few trap cards, so if you draw a bad hand, there's not really that much that you can do to protect yourself from their incoming push. And if your opponent is skilled enough at this format, he will understand that the Hero Frog deck has some of the best top decks in the game, and therefore putting you on a clock and establishing a board that you cannot counteract in a good way is the way to beat the deck. So what are the flaws of Miracle Fusion? As we just mentioned in the Hero Frog deck, the flaws are that it's bad early game. Something like Caius, Dark Arm Dragon are also not the best the first few turns, seeing as you usually cannot summon them unless you have a good way to cheat them out, either by fueling up the graveyard super quick or getting a 3-bone frog into the graveyard with the frog deck. But Miracle Fusion just requires that much more setup. And the issue with Miracle Fusion is that it's not a standalone card. You can play 1, 2, or 3 copies of Caius, you can even play more in the form of Risa. It all depends on how you want to build your deck. With Miracle Fusion, it's very hard to justify just playing 1 or 2 copies, because you need to play so many hero cards in your deck to be able to activate it. And also need another attribute, so it needs to be in a deck where you already have other cards in your deck, so you can't use the hero cards as a standalone engine, apart from something like Hero Beat. There is a zombie hero deck that utilizes only 1 or 2 copies of Miracle Fusion. In that it gets a bit different, because the Stratos, being able to get you Malicious, can pair with your zombie cards or Diva and make plays that way. And you're not as reliant on Miracle Fusion, seeing as you can utilize Stratos and it's just good enough in your deck. However, for the Frog deck, Stratos grabbing you an Alias or a Malicious or an Ocean or a Malicious Edge or an Infernal Prodigy, it's just not as good as summoning Caius every single turn. So for the Hero Frog deck, a lot of the issues you run into are that you have to play a lot of hero cards that are essentially bricks to fit the free copies of Miracle. And thereby you have to make certain concessions in your deck. A lot of people cut down Swap Frog to 2, or they just don't play enough defense. They aren't able to utilize the full extent of the Frog engine, playing free copies of Dupe Frog, Des Frog, Flip Flop Frog, Fishbook Blaster. A lot of these cards that extend the ceiling of your deck. The ability to abuse Substitute and being able to use this as the main way you get advantage. That's just not a thing that the hero deck can do. Another flaw of Miracle Fusion is more so the monsters that you are summoning. So let's say you're summoning Absolute Zero. Unlike something like The Shining playing into a Torrential Mirror Force is able to get you back monsters. If you clear Absolute Zero, all it does is Regeki the board. Which is of course nothing to scoff at. Clearing all their monsters in a single push is a very good thing to do. However, when people really start to play around Absolute Zero, it gets a whole lot worse. In 2024, most good players have Absolute Zero on their mind. Therefore, they don't summon large boards that are a way to protect from Absolute Zero. So a way to counteract Absolute Zero is to have a Bottomless or a Dimensional Prison along with either Stardust Dragon, a Starlight Road, My Body as a Shield, something to protect from the Absolute Zero trigger effect destroying your monsters. A couple years ago, when people weren't as adept in Edison format, being able to summon Absolute Zero into an entire board, just crashing it and blowing up everything and they lost from there, was something that happened a lot more often. Today, people just don't blindly summon a bunch of monsters just to have a field presence, because they know that Miracle Fusion might come down at any moment. Particularly if you already have the setup in graveyard and you have a couple unknowns in your hand. It's not unreasonable to assume that you might have Miracle Fusions in your hand, and thereby you don't make too much of a board unless you can kill them or have a way to play around the Absolute Zero. The issue lies partly in the hero cards as well. Stratos is of course a very good card, being able to get you a monster on summon, but in Edison format, a lot of the decks are already normal summon reliant. So what you do is you add more normal summons to your deck to make Miracle Fusion good. But when Miracle Fusion isn't as good as it was a couple of years ago, the hero cards aren't as good either, because their payoff is lesser. So since we know that the top 3 decks are Vayu, Blackwing, and Frog variants, Miracle Fusion is just not as good. Let's take the Frog deck for example. You activate Miracle Fusion into their empty board and just want to push damage, because if they summon any monarch and get rid of it, it was just a 1-for-1. Your huge payoff of Miracle Fusion traded with their 1 Caius in hand. Great. Summoning an Absolute Zero into a Frog field full of dupe Frogs and Substitutes is a bit better. Dupe Frog still gets back Frogs to their hand. They usually have a bunch of cards left in their hand that they can still use to play the game. Blackwing plays a lot of trap cards. This deck can just summon 1 or 2 monsters at a time and use their trap cards, such as Dimensional Prison and Bottomless, so that when you do summon the Absolute Zero, you blow up their maybe 1 Armed Wing that they can use the Vayu in graveyard to summon an Armor Master with. Now for the Vayu deck, it gets a little bit better, because against Vayu, you're at least able to deal with their set monsters. Let's say they have a bunch of Hamsters and Raikos that you weren't able to crack through. Well, summoning an Ab-Zero can just clear them all away, if they have that along with another monster like an Armed Wing or whatever. Absolute Zero also being above their Armed Wing threshold is also an important distinction. So I do think that Miracle Fusion against the Vayu deck is a bit better than Frogs and Blackwing. But then Vayu is also naturally a deck that can play Royal Oppression, so you run into the issue of your Miracle Fusion just being oppressed. or Ab-Zero is just gonna get trapped and then they can push next turn with their Vayu effect in the graveyard. Now, to say all this, Miracle Fusion is not a bad card. Summoning an Ab-Zero into a board that wasn't properly protected against it is something that will happen, even against good players. You can't always play around Miracle into Ab-Zero in an effective manner. Particularly in something like the Hero Beat deck, this deck needs a bomb, and Miracle Fusion is that bomb. While it is of course nice that the Frog deck can utilize something like the Hero Package to gain additional bombs, when you have all of these already, it's not a necessary thing to do, and you need to take into consideration that Miracle Fusion might not be good enough anymore in your Hero Frog deck. You should play something like Dream Frogs or Control Frogs instead, because the meta has simply shifted. Now, one important thing to mention about the Hero Frog deck is that it does make some of the matchups a little bit easier. Something like Gladiator Beast struggles a lot with Stratos into Alias, seeing as their attack threshold is 18 with Laquari, unless they've tagged it out, and Alias gets over it and Stratos crashes with it. So your matchup against GB is of course a lot better with the hero cards in your deck, and they can't really deal with Ab-Zero. But you could also make the argument that Gladiator Beast is not a very prevalent deck. And the deck is naturally quite flawed, so you should beat that deck anyway. And hedging for the top 3 decks, being Blackwing, the Frog Mirror, and Vayu, is a better thing to do in your Frog deck. I do have a Hero Beat deck that I've been working on, which doesn't play any of these bad water monsters like Diva and Gilman, which cost additional bricks and are additional normal summons that don't really work with your game plan of controlling the game, but still is able to play Miracle Fusion. Some people play Crystal Seer or Snowman Eater in place for their water monsters, but I believe these cards are just too weak going second. Setting either of them into either Blackwing or Vayu is not good enough. Even against Frog and just getting Monarch is not a very good play. But there is a way, with the Hero Beat engine, that you can easily access water monsters and make Miracle Fusion still be a live enough card. So if you guys would like to see that profile, let me know in the comments. Ultimately, I'm still a big fan of Miracle Fusion. It's still a good card into a lot of different decks and trap cards, seeing as it plays around cards like Pulling the Rug, and it still is able to clear their board through Bottomless and Dimensional Prison. But the card does have its flaws. If there are any other cards in Edison format you guys would like to see an in-depth analysis of, let me know in the comments.